Well, hello everybody. Welcome back. Welcome back to the Abstract Machine. I know it's been a while, but I've been busy. I've been working on putting together a video on violence, and so I came across this text by Rene Girard, "Violence and the Sacred," and so I purchased the book and got through the first chapter. And I just thought that there was a lot of real interesting things going on in there. So I decided to read it closely and try to put together a presentation, which takes a lot of time. And so here we are. Yeah, welcome back. Let's get started. So who is Rene Girard? Rene Girard was a French historian, literary critic, and social theorist. He lived from 1923 to 2015. So he is a relatively recent scholar, thinker. He's credited as the founder of mimetic theory of desire. This is the idea that human desire is, by its nature, imitative. And as we will see, this is the source of conflict that leads eventually to violence. So the focus of this presentation, the focus of this video is going to be on the first chapter titled Sacrifice. So the running question of the first chapter is not how do humans become violent necessarily, but rather the main question is how do humans manage to control violence long enough to live together at all? Which is an interesting question, because if, as some philosophers, some thinkers have noted in the past, we are always, if not engaging in direct conflict, we're always at the brink of it. As we will see, we'll bring Kant into this analysis. He has this interesting little quote. So, but for Girard, the answer to this question will turn out to be in the problem itself. In other words, violence is not pure disruption of the social. It is that, but it is also the organizing principle on which community or the social rests. And we will see what that means. So the role of mimetic desire does not play a big factor in this chapter. However, we'll just mention a couple things just in case it comes up. So Girard's question to the answer of what causes violence is more or less associated to the theory of mimetic desire. So the idea here is that we desire what others desire, and inevitably this will lead to conflict. For example, if there's person A who desires object X, person B will desire the same object X precisely because person A desires that object. And so inevitably we can already see that if there is only one object, X, it can be owned, at least in Girard's theory. Object X can only belong to either person A or person B. So this is, Girard tells us, we don't have to agree, but this is his theory. This is his analysis, his ideas. So he says that this is the source of conflict, desire. And as he says, quote, violence is not completely irrational. Rather, violence has its reasons, end quote. And so that quote there, that's real interesting because Girard to an extent flips the idea of violence, the irrationality of violence, on its head. Historically, violence has been taken to be an uncontrollable burst of drives, of passions, of emotions, just pure irrationality. For Girard, violence is not completely irrational. Violence is, by and large, very rational. It is, as we will see, one of the organizing principles of communities. Although there's another aspect of violence that is irrational, and that's the according to Girard, that's a bad type of violence that we need to avoid. So in this chapter, sacrifice plays a big role. Girard tells us that the greatest threat to early societies was internal violence, especially in the form of revenge. So the question is, what has prevented humanity from destroying itself if we're always at the brink of violence? According to Girard, sacrifice serves to redirect this dangerous violence onto a substitute victim. This is what he calls the scapegoat, or this is what is known as the scapegoat. So for Girard, in order to avoid these cycles of endless violence or revenge, this is, as I was saying before, this is an irrational aspect of violence, of revenge. So Girard tells us that historically, communities, societies, they've always been able to redirect this irrational violence onto a substitute victim, onto a scapegoat. And what this does is that it has a very rational function, which is for the society, that the scapegoat creates a safe outlet for these destructive impulses that otherwise plague humanity. So what evidence, where does Girard take his analysis or his evidence for sacrifice? Girard looks at sacrifice in Greek tragedy, and he gives us a quote, "When examined closely for traces of human sacrifice, Greek tragedy offers some remarkable revelations. In Euripides' play Medea, the principle of human substitution appears in its most savage form. Frightened by the intensity of Medea's rage against her faithless husband, Jason, the nurse begs the children's tutor to keep these charges out of the mother's way. I am sure her anger will not subside until has found the victim. Because Jason is out of reach, Medea substitutes her own children." End quote. So, in Medea's play, Euripides' play Medea, Medea gets enraged by her faithless husband, and her uncontrollable rage, given that Jason, her husband, is away and she cannot expel this violence out of her onto Jason, she finds a substitute. This violence has to be channeled somewhere, and so tragically, she takes it out on her children. She kills her children, basically. That's the point that Girard brings in from the play. So this is the substitution, and And obviously, we can interpret that in many different ways. But for Girard, the idea is that there is the violence has to be channeled. It has to be put somewhere, and the best way possible is to find a substitute, a scapegoat. In this case, the violence got channeled through onto her children. But anyway, so Girard takes another example, and he tells us that Medea, like Ajax, reminds us of the fundamental truth about violence. And this is the point that I was making before, that if violence is left unpoliced, violence will accumulate until it overflows its confines and floods the surrounding area. That's a quote from the book. So violence needs to be fulfilled. Otherwise, it will accumulate and it will overflow any confines surrounding it. This is basically, if violence does not get under control, it can become a plague. It can become a sort of irrational cycles of violence. And as we will see, there is something contagious about blood. Girard will tell us that blood, to an extent, symbolizes the threat of more violence to come. But we will see that a little bit later. So as I was saying, the role of sacrifice is to stem this rising tide of indiscriminate substitutions and redirect violence into its proper channels. That's another quote from chapter 1. So that's what we are supposed to do with violence, according to Girard. We're supposed to find a substitution, and the best case scenario is to find a sort of symbolic substitution, which, as we will see, it will be in the form of festivals or symbolic sacrificial rituals. So Girard tells us that violence takes a substitution. Violence needs to be appeased. So a substitution will do. However, the substitution must resemble the group that threatens the group, the community, the society. And so this is known as the scapegoat mechanism for restoring peace. And so what it does is that the sacrifice of the substitution serves to protect the entire community from its own violence. It protects the community from turning that violence inward into themselves. And Girard has this really interesting example. It seems like it's an attempt to bring, try to give another example that is not from Greek tragedy or from biblical passages or primitive societies. He brings in an example from biology. And so I did not cross-reference this quote, the accuracy of that claim, but Girard says that there are species of fish that if they're deprived of their natural enemies, they will turn their aggression against the members of their own family. And I've heard things like that, and so it is not difficult to believe that will be that is the case. So this is Girard's claim that what he's saying that the violence needs to be appeased, and if you don't find the right channel, fish in this case. They turn their aggression against their own family, which is an interesting example. So base case scenario is a symbolic substitution for violence. So Girard tells us about the Greek pharmakos. The Greek pharmakos is an ancient ritual figure, often a scapegoat, used in purification ceremonies meant to cleanse a city of pollution, bad fortune, or divine anger, end quote. And what is meant to cleanse a city of pollution? This gives us. This is when Girard, at some point, he equates Oedipus, the king, as he becomes a scapegoat, and he gives us analysis. He gives an interpretation of Oedipus, and he says how he's the pharmakos of the city. He's getting rid of himself, eliminating Oedipus from the city will amount to cleansing the city of the pollution that he brought upon the city. But anyway, that's for another time. The desire to commit an act of violence on those near us cannot be suppressed without a conflict. We must divert that impulse, therefore, toward the sacrificial victim, the creature we can strike down without fear of reprisal, since he lacks a champion, end quote. And this is precisely one of the main reasons why I found Girard's analysis of violence and the scapegoat very compelling, because the current American politics, the rhetoric and the logic of the right-wing conservative American politics in 2025 is very much along the lines of shamelessly finding scapegoats for any problems. For all the problems of America, they find sacrificial creatures that they feel they can strike down without fear of reprisal, because the sacrificial groups lack a champion, right? So here we can think of immigrants. Here we can think of transgenders. Here we can think of every group that the right-wing faction of America demonizes, right? But more on that to come. So Girard says that there are these two levels of violence: sacrifice and vengeance. Vengeance is a viciously endless and uncontrollable expression of violence. That's a violence to be avoided, like the plague, because it can turn into a plague. Sacrifice, on the other hand, is controlled and legitimizes chaos or tames chaos. So sacrifice, rational violence, legitimate violence is basically the antidote to uncontrollable violence. Nevertheless, violence is the solution to violence, according to Girard. So sacrifice is supposed to break the cycles of reciprocal violence the vengeance induces. And here's a quote where he tells us that vengeance is an interminable, indefinitely repetitive process. And here we should take note of the interminable, indefinitely repetitive process. That sounds a lot like repetition in Freud and in connection to the unconscious. So, as we've been saying before, there are 3 levels of violence: uncontrollable violence, which is vengeance; controlled violence, which is sacrifice; and symbolic violence, which is ritual substitution. And so the rites of sacrifice serve to protect or serve to polarize the community's aggressive impulses and redirect them toward victims that may be actual or figurative, animate or inanimate, end quote. So ideally, that would be the best. The symbolic violence would be the best expression of violence, because no actual human individual or group needs to be sacrificed. And symbolic rituals or symbolic violence, the victim may be figuratively, it can be inanimate, or it can be symbolic. It can be a non-living organism, basically. It just has to symbolize. It has to be a placeholder for this flow of violence that needs to be channeled. But what is the problem with violence, or more specifically with vengeance? The problem is that violence spreads like a disease. Violence needs outlets. Without them, as he said before, violence overflows any confines. And also, when violence is too long held in check, as we said before, it will overflow its bounds. And as he says, and woe those who happen to be nearby. End quote. And now here, obviously there's been many people, and there's been many philosophers, I believe Hobbes, other people, they've said, the state of nature, it's savage and ruthless and violence. And here's somebody else who kind of echoes that idea that even in a really so the person that I'm referring to is Kant. The next quote here is from Kant, but even for someone like Kant who believes in these enlightened teleology of progress, and up to his point in humanity, Kant had this high optimism that we were erasing the evils of the past. Even himself, he believed that we were always at the brink of war and hostilities with each other. So here's a quote. Everybody forgot where I took it from, but the quote says, "The state of nature is not a state of peace among human beings who live next to one another, but a state of war that is, if not always an outbreak of hostilities, then at least the constant threat of such hostilities." End quote. Yeah, this is Immanuel Kant. So that brings us to the sacred. Now remember, the title of this book is Violence and the Sacred. So what connection could there be between violence and the sacred? At first sight, they seem to be opposites, categories that do not belong in the same area. So, French sociologist Émile Durkheim, he gave a famous definition of what the sacred is, and he says that the sacred is what a community venerates and protects, And he also added that historically the sacred has served to bind communities together through ritual, and as well as marking insiders and outsiders, who belongs to the community, who does not belong to the community. Some of the examples of the sacred were ritualized practices around it, such as sacrificial festivals, burial sites, and these were crucial in forming lasting cultural identities. And if you guys don't already foresee the connection between the sacred and violence, it will be made explicit pretty soon. But that definition of the sacred basically gives us the connection to violence and the sacred for Girard. And at least in this first chapter, I don't think Girard really makes it all that explicit, the function of the sacred. He gives us a definition, as we will see. He gives us a definition of what the sacred is, but he does not make the connection explicit to violence, or at least not very explicit. So he says, this is Girard, quote, "The sacred consists of all those forces whose dominance over men increases or seems to increase in proportion to men's effort to master them," end quote. As an example, so he says tempests, forest fires, and plagues, among other phenomena, they may be classified as sacred. Like the plague, the resemblance violence bears to these natural cataclysms is not limited to the realm of poetic imagery. Violence is the heart and secret soul of the sacred. So as we said before, Durkheim's notion of the sacred, that the sacred serves to bind communities together. If we take that notion and the idea that the sacred marks insiders and creates insiders and outsiders, we can see that for Girard, violence is also sacred, right? Especially vengeance, especially violence, and we should note here that violence is manifold is complex for Girard. As we said, there is violence channeled rationally, and there is irrational violence, and this irrational violence is the one that threatens to control us. So it seems like Girard wants to say that violence is sacred precisely because it is always what propels, what pushes us to want to manage violence. However, I don't think he makes this very explicit, but we try to control violence through sacrifice, rational violence, and scapegoat mechanisms. But I don't think I could say that we are always successful at managing violence. So this must fall into the definition of the sacred for Girard. And also the other aspect of it is that the control violence is for Girard what serves the function of binding communities through ritual as well. So what else could play a role? What about blood? The association of violence is always the first association to violence is always blood, right? Blood for Girard and for other ethnologists, plays an important symbolic role. For Girard, there is, and I think Girard is, I'm not exactly sure to what extent he read Hegel or to what extent he was influenced by dialectics, but it seems like there is always a dialectic at work with Girard. There is a dialectic at work with violence, and now we're going to see a dialectic at work with blood. So for Girard, blood is both purifying and polluting. He says, when violence is unloosed, blood appears everywhere. On the ground, underfoot, forming great pools. Its presence proclaims murder and announces new upheavals to come. Blood stains everything it touches with the color of violence and death. End quote. I mean, that's a very descriptive, and I think it's a very good sentence, couple of sentences, paragraph. Some others might disagree, but I think he's an interesting thinker, and I think he's also I think he's a good writer. So the negation of blood. This is the dialectic side of blood that I was referring to. That blood has also the function of healing and purifying. And as I noted before, violence shares its dual nature as well. Girard notices that sexuality also happens to be one of those forces that has sovereignty over men. So, according to his definition of the sacred, that leads us to the conclusion that sexuality is also sacred. So violence and sex are also sacred. But why would that be? What would be the connection between sex and violence? That seems to be an idea for movies where orgies and fetishisms and kinks that people are into with in a connection. This is an association that we make of people that are into like BDSM practices, like masochism and sadomasochism, and we associate these people as we think of these people as, like, if not pathological, sexually pathological, like close, like as like flirting with the pathological line of sexuality. And here Girard says that there's he disagrees. He would say that there is a very deep connection between sex and violence. So what's a signifier for Girard? The points to the phenomenon of this connection. He says, we can only assume that this extreme reaction has to do with the sexual aspect of menstruation. End quote. As we said before, violence, if you go back to the previous slide, Girard says that violence stains everything it touches with the color of violence and death. And now here, the connection to sex is that it may be that it has to do with the sexual aspect of menstruation, blood. So, sex and violence frequently come to grips in such direct forms as abduction, rape, defloration, and various sadistic practices, as well as in indirect actions of indefinite consequences, Girard tells us. Furthermore, quote, sex is at the origin of various illnesses, real or imaginary. It culminates in the bloody labors of childbirth, which may entail the death of the mother, child, or both together, end quote. So these are the connections that Girard makes regarding situations where we see a connection, right? Where we see it does not happen as much as it used to back in the day, pre-modern medicine. Death due to child labor was a lot more common, to an extent that we cannot even understand, we cannot even relate to today, because of, some people would say, the wonders of modern medicine and the hospital. But back in the day, it was normal for mothers to lose the child, and also it was common for both, due to birth complications, for the mother and the child to die at the same time. And so this is the connection that Girard makes, the sex, blood, and death, where they show up at the same place, at the same time. So, but there are also connections to ritual, blood and sex in rituals, otherwise known as orgies. So here I take an example from George Bataille. George Bataille has a book called The Story of the Eye, and it's one of the strangest books I've ever read in my life. It is so graphic, it is sexual and violent, and I just could not understand. And it's also it's very non sequitur a lot of the time. There are these gaps in the narrative that it just leave you wondering, what is the point? So, but I do, when I was going through the analysis, when I was putting together this video, it reminded me of a scene or a passage in the book, Story of the Eye, where George Bataille tells a story when he was a teenager, and he had he tells a story that he went to they had a party at a friend's house, and him and a bunch of other kids, because they were all around the age of 12, 13. When the parents were absent, they got together and they got drunk. They got very, very drunk, to the point that they started the kids, the group of kids, they started having an orgy, and they just went all out, to put it lightly. So here's a quote from the book. Upon seeing me, she displayed a sickly but violent terror. After all, I was pale, smeared with blood, my clothes askew. During the orgy, splinters of glass had left bleeding cuts in two of us. The resulting stench of blood, sperm, urine, and vomit made me almost recoil in horror. Unquote. So that's one of the most impactful passages in the book. It's very descriptive. It's very evocative of the images, and Bataille gives no explanation as to why even give such a description of such a situation that would be shameful to most, to even read out loud from other person's words. But in any case, I thought that would be an interesting example, is also where violence, the connection between violence and sex and blood and ritual kind of gather around. But ritual also, as Girard was saying before, ritual also has, or Girard was saying that blood is also purifying. And here I take another example from George Bataille. This one's going to be from the Cursed Chair. And as we said before, ritual for Girard separates the sacred from the impure, and or in other words, legitimate violence from irrational violence, which is vengeance or revenge. And so here's an example that George Bataille gives in his book, The Cursed Chair. And I think the meaning as to where it fits into Girard's analysis is still a little bit unclear to me. Does it fit into rational, legitimate violence, or does it fit into a non-utilitarian or non-rational form of violence? But anyway, so here's the quote. The human sacrifices of Mexico represent an apex of horror in the cruel chain of religious rites. The priests kill their victims on top of the pyramids. They will stretch them over a stone altar and strike them in the chest with an obsidian knife. They will tear out the still beating heart and raise it thus to the sun. Most of the victims were prisoners of war, which justified the idea of wars as necessary to the life of the sun. They thought that if they ceased, the sun would cease to give light. End quote. So is that a form of... That seems to me that that they sacrifice those rituals, sacrificial rituals for the Aztecs, fit the logic of rational violence, Girard's rational violence. But Bataille, in the same book, I believe he says that there was no real necessity. I believe he contradicts himself. I think he says that there was no real utilitarian necessity for those rituals, that they were just pure expenditure. That they were in a sense, that a lot of this violence, it was just pure excess of energy that needed to be expended. But anyway. So is there a necessity to create a distinction between the pure and the impure? Yes. Why? Because blurring these distinctions destroys the legitimacy of violence and opens up the possibility of endless cycles of violence. In other words, as I said before, violence becomes legitimate in the way we use it. And I know that at some point some people might be thinking, well, okay, that might be that may be the rationality, and it may be the idea in plays, in Greek plays, in biblical passages, in certain so-called primitive societies, tribal life, and things like that. But what does that have to do with our modern life? Like we don't legitimize violence anymore. We don't legitimize violence by calling it rational. To which I would say, really, And my response would be, isn't war basically a form of legitimate violence, legitimized violence? Yeah. What about capital punishment? Isn't that another form of legitimate violence? So what I think is interesting in Girard's analysis is that it is that his analysis is pertinent to our current life, to modern life. His analysis does not stop with tribal or ancient times. It still applies today. And at some point towards the end of the chapter, he says that precisely one of the ways in which we have legitimized violence is in the form of the law. Now, it is no longer up to me to take revenge, but it is up to the law to properly apply that violence. But in any case, this is one of the functions of sacrifice, which it keeps these opposites apart. Girard gives another example from the Bible. He talks about Cain and Abel. He says, quote, "The violence, as we've been saying, violence, if there is the biggest takeaway of this chapter, I would say is here." And this is a direct quote verbatim from the text. Girard's words are capitalized in that first part of the first fragment. Girard says, uppercase, violence is not to be denied. I believe that is the main message of the book, of the chapter, perhaps of the whole book. Violence is not to be denied, but it must be diverted to another object. He says, such is one of the meanings of the story of Cain and Abel. Girard says that the Bible offers no background on the two brothers, except the bare fact that Cain is a tiller of the soil who gives the fruits of his labor to God, whereas Abel is a shepherd who regularly sacrifices the firstborn of his herds. One of the brothers kills the other, and the murderer is the one who does not have the violence outlet of animal sacrifice at his disposal. End quote. The brother that kills the other is the one that does not have the violence outlet. So Cain is the tiller of the soil. He's the one that does not have the violence outlet. So he kills his brother, Abel. The one who has the violence outlet, the sacrificing the firstborn of his herds. And so this is his point. Girard says that there is jealousy. There's Cain's jealousy of his brother is another term for his one characteristic trait, his lack of a sacrificial outlet. So Cain is jealous of the fact that his brother has a channel for his violence, whereas he doesn't. So in Girard's interpretation, this lack of channel for violence leads Cain to channel this violence onto his brother. He says, what we have here is no mystical hocus pocus, but an intuitive insight into the essential function of sacrifice, gleaned exclusively from the scant references in the Bible, end quote. So the final synthesis, the final conclusions. As we've said before many times, violence must not be suppressed, but rather channeled properly. Violence accepts substitutions. Violence is sacred. That is, violence organizes communities around it. This is sacrificial acts, and the sacrificial acts are they surround the sacrifice of a symbolic victim or a scapegoat. Sacrifice and ritual festivals serve as containment systems for revenge, which is irrational violence, and without outlets, violence overflows its confines. And as a final quote, Girard gives us, he says that, quote, neither primitive nor modern man has found the microbe responsible for violence, end quote. Even though it appears that he's given us a reason to believe why violence arises, which is through the nature of mimetic desire. But he does not make that very explicit in that first chapter. So we will leave that for another time. And one of the other interesting connections and conclusions that I didn't mention here in the last slide is the connection, the symbolic role that blood plays in the sacred, in violence, in sex. And yeah, I think there was a good amount of content for just chapter 1 of Violence and the Sacred, which I think it's very interesting. And as I said before, it's one of the reasons why I find it so interesting is because we like to believe that we're beyond that we're beyond the simple primitive logic of sacrificing scapegoats. But I think that the reason why this grabbed my attention was because I see that very strongly playing a very strong role in today's American politics. The scapegoating mechanism is just at an all-time high. It's just shameless. It's absolutely shameless how American politics, right-wing American politics, uses the scapegoating mechanism just shamelessly. There is no attempt to either to hide their enthusiasm to place the blame that nobody believes on scapegoating groups. And I think that we must be alert to the scapegoating logic. We should not accept it. We should always call it out whenever we see it. And yeah, we should always be vigilant to break those irrational cycles of scapegoating mechanisms. Those ways of shifting the blame onto the victim that lacks a champion. Yep. And with that, I'll end this video. And thank you for tuning into the Abstract Machine podcast again. See you next time.